Thanks everybody for coming. This is a great turnout. We're here today to hear from Harvey Locke, who is the co-founder of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, and who we worked on a great project with in 2011, the result of which was this book, but we did an exhibit that Harvey conceived and we all worked on together, where we talked about how artists have painted up and down the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor since the age of Carl Rungus, and Carl Rungus was probably the first one to really do that. And so we looked at our own art through a different conservation-oriented lens, and it was really amazing for us to do that. Harvey also sent local painter Dwayne Hardy out into the field to paint these important spots along the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor to bring relevance to how important these places are today. So I'm not going to talk very much longer. I'm going to turn it over to Harvey, who will be happy to walk us through some of this history and some of the Rungus exhibits that we have up today. So, welcome.
Thanks, Evan.
Yeah.
My colleague Renee Crisco from the Yellowstone Yukon Conservation Initiative. She and I will be wandering around together all day, and feel free to talk to Renee as well. It's always a great thrill to be in this wonderful museum. It's just like you walk in here and you go, wow. And the reason you walk in here and go, wow, is because this is kind of the house or the room that Carl Rungus built. If you look, you drove up Rungus Way to get here. Literally, that's what the road is called. And you're now surrounded by Carl Rungus's paintings. All these magnificent paintings on the wall are Carl Rungus paintings. And these paintings are not accidental paintings. These paintings were written to help promote wildlife conservation. And they hung in the Bronx Zoo for many years. And tonight I'll be speaking in the theater, and I'll get into the significance of Carl Rungus as an important force in our perception of wildlife and wildlife conservation. Much more important than most people realize, and how important it is to the presence of our wildlife today. And I'll also talk about bigger questions of its relevance today and in the future tonight. But what I wanted to do today, which is fun for me, is to share with you some insights into the paintings as we walk through these galleries that will also help you to be able to actually see where these paintings are with a couple of little clues. At least we did it on a guinea pig already, and it seemed to work. We'll try to look at the paintings as they are. We'll go to three places. And we'll begin with just pointing out that the National Museum of Wildlife Art's collection is a heavily Yellowstone to Yukon art collection. And in that book that Adam and I worked on together that he was showing you, we figured out that about 11 of the artists who are in the collection here actually painted on both sides of the Canada-US border. And so while this is the National Museum of Wildlife Art, it's really the Museum of the Yellowstone to Yukon art in terms of the mountain stuff. And then of course you have other wonderful things like the black bear in Maine or in New Brunswick and things like that, and then your wonderful African art collection. But the foundation of this collection here is actually a Yellowstone to Yukon region collection, which is kind of fun. So without further ado, let's just look over my head at these paintings. And that painting and that painting are in the Canadian Rockies. So you know Banff National Park. And I will try to show you how you can tell where the paintings are. As Rungus was so good, as Dwayne Hardy, the wildlife artist, said to me last night as we were in Teton Park, he said, Rungus is so good he drew from the inside out. That he understood inside structurally both the animals and the landscape, and then he could make it real for you. And one of the most extraordinary things about Rungus's work is even if he imagined the place, you know where it is, if you know the landscape. And I'll try to take, if we go down this hallway, I'll show you how that comes alive in the painting. So one of the most interesting things about the paintings you'll see here, and this is a fabulous hallway that Adam and team curated of Rungus's work, is just mind-blowing collection of this stuff. But one of the most interesting things about Rungus's work is you can see an evolution in it from an animal as an object. So remember at the time Carl Rungus comes here, it's the 1890s, and they're are two ways of talking about animals. There's game and vermin. And game is useful to people, and vermin is bad for people. And then Rungus is not so much involved in the words as he is in the images, but you look at his early paintings and he's painting game. You know, I can shoot this. But he's part of a shift that occurs, led by another artist and a great writer, Ernest Thompson Seton, who invented the word wildlife. And the word wildlife was invented to convey the idea that these animals have an existence in and of themselves. And Ernest Thompson Seton's books were as widely read as the Harry Potter books are now. If you can imagine that. There's a book called Biography of a Grizzly or Wild Animals I've Known that where like many, 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 many people read them. And all of a sudden there's this thing called wildlife. And of course we're not in the Museum of Game and Vermin Art. We're in the Museum of Wildlife Art. And so look at this painting. Those are two moose looking at the landscape being part of the ecosystem. They are not objects, they're not targets. And Rungus was so good that when he gets into his prime, which is a fun name of this painting here, so I'll get everybody to shift down here, and we'll gather around again. So this painting is called In His Prime, right there. And there are a whole bunch of things embedded in that painting that I think are really fun to talk about. So Rungus painted here, painted in the Yukon, and he primarily painted in the area of Banff National Park. That's where his studio was, and he spent many, many, many years of his life. That's where I live, and where my family's from. It's Banff. And I saw this painting, it's called In Its Prime, and I knew instantly where it was. And I look at the land, how can you tell where that is? Because Rungus was so good that he could convey the structure of the mountains he was looking at. This is a famous mountain called Mount Rundle. But I knew exactly where that was. And it turns out that painting, which is very similar, is called Under Mount Rundle. When it was fun, when we did this art show that Adam mentioned earlier, we started it here, and we brought in the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies collection as well as the artwork that Dwayne Hardy did, and then we had folks up to Banff, the team here came to Banff, and I took everybody to this very location. You can actually go there. And this is only about a mile and a half from where Carl Lungus's house was, called the Paint Box, this image. And the other thing that's interesting about the painting is you see that elk. That elk is an elk that was reintroduced to Banff Park, descended, reintroduced to Banff Park in 1917 from Yellowstone. Just as you probably know that the wolves that you have down here came from up around Banff. And so this exchange of things has been inherent in the landscape for a very long time. And what's so interesting is the artists like Rungus, but not only Rungus, Belmore Brown, Mr. Proctor, many others, Robert Lougheed, as you go through time, they all painted just up and down here. That's what they did, because they were interested in these animals and where they are. And so this collection here is just full of them. But it's kind of fun when you can look at that and go, there's a conservation story in that. It's related to Yellowstone Park and the Elk Refuge, and also modern day conservation. And tonight when I speak, I'll get into much more of that level of detail. And I also want to show you something else that's really fun about these paintings. For example, this is a painting of pack horses in the Canadian Rockies right here. And that moose picture, for those of you who are back there, you can get the same effect by looking at those two paintings, the big canvases there on the right. What you see is big square blocks. And you can see those brush strokes are big and rectangular in those. Well, that's how the Canadian Rockies are structured. They're sedimentary rocks with big blocky shapes. And that's just how it is there. Whereas that painting there, which is of a white bark pine and the Wind River Range, you can see the mountains are different. That's because it's an old piece of the Canadian Shield, or geologically the Wyoming province, it's called here in the States. And it's been eroded by glaciers, and it's been shaped very differently. And you will see his work from here and his work there having these fundamentally different landscape structures in them and the vegetation in them. So he's not just throwing up a random backdrop. He's actually into the place, he's understanding the place, and if you know the place, you can tell, even if you don't have any detail like this painting, you can tell instantly where it is, because he was focused on the whole thing, not the object, but the place and the feeling. And they say that Cubism is about seeing stuff from inside out, right? And Rungus is doing that kind of thing with his paintings as he gets more mature. So in this fabulous members lounge here, we have some great Rungus paintings. And you can see what I was talking about the different structure of the landscape and what he's painting in these two paintings here on the right. So that painting there is for sure in the Canadian Rockies. And this painting is in the Wind River. How can you tell? Let's take so the elk are very similar. So it's not about the elk. In fact, the elk are very similar because of the same damn elk. Separated genetically, they're the same animals. But what you can see here is, for example, the Wind River Range, if you've ever been in it, is full of what geologists call roche-moutonnées, which is glaciers that have overridden rocks. And they round them. And there's also like high mountains, like I've climbed Gannett Peak, for example, and these mountains have big cirques cut out of them by glaciers, which gives them their shape. They're beautiful mountains of the River Range. But they're very rounded. And it's because it's a piece of the Canadian Shield, which is extremely hard rock, that was uplifted. The Canadian Shield is mostly in Canada, but there's a piece of it here in Wyoming. And the Beartooths are another piece of it, if you know the Beartooth Mountains. That's the oldest continental rock in North America. And you can see the rounding, the shaping. And you also see there's some sage and things here in this painting. Even though it's an impressionistic painting, the cool thing about impressionism, you know what you're seeing even if you can't see it. If you get really close to it, all you see is muck. And you stand back there and you say, oh, I see sage, I see trees. But that's the cool thing about impressionism, right? And Rungus is very good at it in mature years. This painting, this is like, if you've ever been in a burn in the Canadian Rockies, is exactly what it looks like. And the way you can tell is the Canadian Rockies are, although elevationally they're lower than the mountains here, they look higher. And it's because the valley bottom is lower. And they're bigger vertical relief mountains than they are here. And so what happened is, although they were glaciated too, in the same, what's called the Wisconsin Ice Gauge, or in the Pinedale Glaciation as you call it, the ice only got that deep. So you see how it's round here, and then it's jagged there. So this stuff is sticking up above the ice. And you'll see that over and over and over again, like that. So you can see rounding and jagging. And you can see the ice still on the rocks. We still have a lot of glaciers out there. So where it's really jagged, where those big orange sheep are on the right, that's the ice didn't, the deep valley glaciers didn't get there. And you can see the thrusting of the rock. So geologically the rock is thrust like this. It's not uplifted and then eroded, it's actually been thrust. And you can see the thrust in the rocks there. You see that? Stuff is on the diagonal. And then Rungus's brush strokes, of course, he's doing this. And he's doing it with great confidence. And so the rhythm of his brush is emphasizing the way the landscape feels. And those are, of course, mountain goats. They are not native to this part of the world, even though you can see them in Yellowstone. They don't actually belong there. They start in glacier, basically, and go north. And the bighorn sheep, I'll point out something. Rungus was also a famous for illustration and for accuracy, not just for art. And the difference between an illustrator and an illustrator is trying to tell you something specific in a teachable moment or a didactic way, and an artist is trying to tell you something emotional. And Rungus was good at both. Those are bighorn sheep. Now take a look at the size of the horns, the massiveness of the horns. That's why they're called bighorns. And then when we go into the other gallery, I'll show you something else. First off, you can see his paint box. He was a plein air painter, which means that he went out and he was painting out in the landscape. And he was, you need to remember that this guy is painting before a camera can take a picture of a moving animal. So you think about that for a minute. He's conveying all of this energy without the aid of movies or photography. And that's part of why it's so powerful and interesting, is because, for example, all those paintings we saw in the lobby, they were in this important gallery in New York at the Bronx Zoo, depicting the animals that people were seeing behind bars in nature. So to try to convey some meaning that was beyond just, well, I see the animal in a cage. And if you look at the paintings in this gallery, there are a couple of really interesting things that you can see. So when I was talking about, you know, the animals in the landscape and so on, and the bighorns, that painting behind there, look at the horns on that. Something else is going on. Yeah, bingo, they're wider. So what's going on there?
Different species.
The different species of animals. Those are called stone sheep.
Oh.
And they have wider flared horns. Just like those Snow White ones do in that corner, which, who would know what those Snow White sheep are called? Doll sheep. And doll sheep and stone sheep are called thin-horned sheep. And it was known that in the Yukon we had thin-horned sheep, and in northern British Columbia we had stone sheep. And of course it was known that we had bighorn sheep, but it wasn't known where the boundary was between them and what was going on. And Rungus was on an expedition as an artist, licensed actually by the government of Yukon as part of the U.S. Geological Survey, to do specimen collecting and figuring out what was going on there and the difference. So he's very involved in sort of scientific field work, and in this, our book here on this, here's Rungus as an illustrator showing the different kinds of thin-horned sheep. And you can see these are really boring from a painting point of view, but they're really, really being carefully anatomically accurate, because there are several color phases of these thin-horned sheep. There's dolls, and there's another sheep called the Fannin sheep, and then there's the stone sheep. And they were trying to figure out what was going on, and there's also an Ogilvy Mountain species, and they can see the distribution here. This is from a book called The Wilderness of the Yukon by Charles Shelton in 1905 that Rungus illustrated. And so this is like primary field science that he's involved in the understanding of wildlife in North America. And what's fun about it is then he's able to take that and say, well, I'll illustrate it for the purposes of this, but for the purposes of the feeling, I'm going to paint that. So that you have a sense of where these things live and how they live in the landscape. And that's in northern British Columbia, in an area we call the Muskoka now. If you look at this painting here, this is in the Wind River Range. And you can tell that it's in the Wind River Range because of the way the mountains are. There's big blocks, less jagged, and there's white bark pine trees, which are characteristic here that we don't have in the Canadian Rockies to anywhere near the same degree. We have them, but nowhere near to the same degree. Rungus gets that, whereas this moose painting, so that moose painting, I can tell you exactly where that is. And the only hint he gives you is in the bottom left-hand corner. You see those mountains? And that is what a fire looks like, a burn that moose like in the Canadian Rockies, and that's a Canada moose, not a Shiraz moose, which is what you have in Wyoming. And you can just tell instantly, if you've been in the front country of the Canadian Rockies after a burn, that's what it looks like, that's what it feels like. And that's the man's genius, is you know instantly what's happening when you see his stuff, if you felt it. And this painting here, which I understand is among the visitors' favorites to the museum, is a place called Lake O'Hara, which is in Yoho National Park, near Banff. The backside of these mountains is Lake Louise, if you've ever heard of that. It's directly behind there. Lake O'Hara is a very beautiful place. And Rungus's contemporaries in art, who are more famous than him in New York, which bugged him, are John Singer Sargent, Winslow Homer. And so Rungus started painting landscapes because wildlife art was considered, that's nice, but it's not art. That's some kind of a lower rent deal for, just human prejudice against animals, basically. But that's how people perceived it. So he said, okay, I can paint. So he's painted landscapes like this. And one landscape he painted, which I'll show tonight in my talk, is called Lake MacArthur. And I will explain the genius of that tonight. I'm not going to blow my powder now. But it won the National Academy of Art Design Medal in 1927 in New York. So he's like, so if I don't put an animal in, I win the award. And I put an animal in, the way harder thing to do, I don't win the award. And that just tells you how kooky art critics can be. And how we see the world is really prejudiced by what we bring to what we see. And this painting is fun because this is Lake O'Hara. There's a similar painting in the collection of the National Gallery of Canada. Not a better one, but a similar one. And this is called Sargent Point because John Singer Sargent went there and painted. And his painting of this is in the Fog Museum in Harvey. But Rungus's painting is probably better. Because Singer Sargent was, Rungus was so comfortable in the outdoors, he used to go out with a man named Jimmy Simpson from Banff who got him into Banff. And Rungus spent 40 years in Banff, and after about 15 years of going out, he'd just go out with a cook and his own pack horses. He didn't need a guide anymore. Singer Sargent, when he was painting at Lake O'Hara, said, I hate being outside and all these bugs, they attack my bottom when I have to go. It's really interesting. And Rungus is totally at ease in that setting. Singer Sargent was a wonderful painter. And he painted the Alps beautifully, and he did two great paintings, the Canadian Rockies, the ones at the Isabella Gardner Stewart, and the other one. He's a great artist, but their degrees of comfort is very different. And I'm going to invite you, because it's a bit crowded, but a fun thing to do is to look at that wall there and do the sesame. So there's 6 paintings on that wall there, and you can do the Sesame Street, which is one of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. So take a look at that, having regard to what I was telling you about the form and structure of the mountains, and see if even though these are just detailed paintings, you can tell which of the paintings is from a different place than the others. So just kind of rotate through and a kind of everybody can parade by there. Take 30 seconds to look at them, and then I'll tell you what's going on there after that. That reveals Rungus's genius. Bang. So if you looked at these paintings, and you bear in mind this idea of the structure of the landscape, rounded white bark pines versus more horizontal and blockier mountains, you can see pretty fast, and I can actually tell you what each of these places is, because I've been to all of them. So this is Lake MacArthur in the Canadian Rockies. This is a place called the Paternoster Lakes. Above Lake O'Hara would be dead in the middle of that painting in the Canadian Rockies. This is Mount Athabasca in the Canadian Rockies. This is Lake O'Hara in the Canadian Rockies. This is Lake O'Hara again, and that's the Wind River Range. How many of you got it right? Wonderful, what good students. So you can see the same thing going on behind me now for those of you who couldn't see what I just demonstrated. So just look at the top row for a minute. With the same stuff in mind. Canadian Rockies, Wind Rivers, Wind Rivers, Wind Rivers, Canadian Rockies. Ice, still there. Horizontal, big blocks. Or rounded, white bark pine trees. And then if you go down this row, you're Canadian Rockies, Canadian Rockies, Canadian Rockies, Wind Rivers, Canadian Rockies, Canadian Rockies, Canadian Rockies, Canadian Rockies, Canadian Rockies, Canadian Rockies, and this one I'm not sure about. And then that could be the foothills of the Canadian Rockies, but it could be down around Bozeman, down this area too. I suspect it's Canadian. And then look at this painting and remember what I was saying about the maturation of his work. So I can't tell you where that landscape is, because this is all about shooting that bear. Okay? The bear is coming into the scene. If you want to shoot an animal, you shoot right there. And it's all about, because he was a hunter, and he was a good hunter, it's about that animal as an object. Whereas if you look, for example, at that sheep painting, it's about the sheep in the setting. And you can see how he evolved, or this moose painting. The moose has looked like he's having a Zen moment, contemplating nature. It's not about the encounter, it's not about the hunt. And it's part of the evolutionary shift in Rungus's work where, and why this is so interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about it tonight. The word ecosystem and the word ecology didn't come into common use until the 1930s. He's painting way before that. And I'll a little preview for tonight, but just a scintillating bit so that it'll blow my talk tonight. That matters, because it's all about how we're perceiving the world and how we choose to live in the world. And Rungus is part of this profound perceptual shift in our relationship with wildlife and wild nature. And to hear the rest, you'll have to come later. Thank you all.
Thank you.